Hello and welcome everybody to our webinar, Rethinking Your Supplier Sourcing, Can You Reshore Your Supply Chain, partnered by Tealbook. Today's session forms part of our Q2 series, looking at gaining a competitive advantage through change and transformation. Throughout this series, our partners and experts will be looking at how procurement can change and what can be done differently in order to add further value to the business. So we've already had a webinar looking at the ideas of diversity within the business, within the supply chain, and sustainability. And today we're going to be focusing more on reshoring. For those who do not know me, my name is Caroline Dillon. I manage content for procurement leaders. And today, I am absolutely delighted to be joined by an amazing panel of speakers. We have Stephany Lapierre, founder and CEO of Tealbook, and Mike Cheny, former senior executive at Procter & Gamble. So I'm just going to take a second to give you a little bit of background on our two experts today, because they've got quite an amazing background. So Stephany has been recognized as one of the top 100 most influential women in supply chain. Her company, Tealbook, has both been named a top 50 company to watch by Spend Matters and won Cool Vendor Award by Gartner. Congrats, Steph, that's great. Prior to Tealbook, Stephany spent 10 years building a successful strategic sourcing and procurement consulting firm focusing on large-scale sourcing optimization projects. And given her experience and visibility into the data issues crippling procurement, she has made it her mission to deliver a trusted source of supplier data to an ever-growing e-procurement space. Mike Cheny. So Mike Cheny is an experienced Fortune 20 senior executive with an extensive global experience and expertise in product supply, innovation, organizational leadership, operational excellence. He served 38 years as a distinguished senior executive at Procter & Gamble. He's held key leadership roles in PG's global grooming, food beverage, healthcare, baby care, feminine care, beauty care businesses, an amazing range of experience. Mike has a proven track record of delivering breakthrough business results for multiple businesses globally through excellent business acumen, strong strategic leadership, and a broad, diverse technical expertise. So now that you know a little bit more about our speakers, I would just like to quickly draw your attention to the icons that you have on your screen. So you have them listed there in the slides, and you have them at the bottom of your screen. The two main ones that I want you to pay attention to so far are the help icon. So if you have any technical glitches, please click that icon. We will do our best to help you out. And then the Q&A icon. So don't wait until the end of this session to ask your questions. We're going to make this very interactive, very free-flowing. This is, we want this to be as conversational as possible. We want to hear from you. We want to hear from your thoughts. So please, at any point, if you have a burning question, put it in the chat via the Q&A, and we'll try and get to it. Okay? Brilliant. I think we're good to go. Stephany, Mike? Yeah? Brilliant.
Absolutely.
So, perfect. So the first point I think I would like to touch upon, and this is just to allow our audience to get a little bit of context in terms of how we are positioning this session today. As all of you will know, President Biden's new executive order that has been signed, it prioritizes the use of American manufacturers and workers. So, Stephany, Mike, I would quite like to start this with your thoughts on how do you think this is going to affect current organizations that may not know where to begin when it comes to reshoring suppliers to work with this mandate? And how does this all relate to effect COVID-19 had on the procurement world? Stephany, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, and I think it's a good sort of problem statement. And to your point, a lot of organizations are looking at their supply chain and their supplier base and trying to see where to even begin. And what we've seen is sort of a couple of points. Companies who today are getting funded by the government are looking to win government contract. If they have, many of their suppliers are offshore, they really have to rethink how to bring suppliers more locally so that they can win government contract and get funded. I think that's a really important point. And the other piece is what we've seen during COVID is massive disruption like no one, and we'll talk about it. Certainly, I'm so honored to be here with Mike because talking about disruption, he's lived them all. But no one anticipated something like COVID to happen. And what we've seen is many organizations, facing with things that they didn't expect, having suppliers offshore and disrupting, business continuity. And so a much, bigger focus on how to have a better distribution of the supply base. And then with this executive order, how do we comply, or how do we even begin to bring our supplier base locally, and what are the implications? I think is a lot of the questions that procurement teams have on their mind.
Yeah, definitely. Mike, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, and look, I think just to add just a little bit to what Stephany said, I think, I hope part of this is, well, it's good around Made in America, and there's a lot of positives with that. But the other element is COVID has brought to the front supply chain disruptions. And, if you have a big supply chain, if you have a global supply chain leaders live disruptions. Sometimes it's weather disruptions, sometimes it's political disruptions, sometimes it's labor disruption. So it's part of it. But I hope what happens here is it'll allow us to design supply chains that are a little more agile, more resilient to disruptions. And I think COVID has brought it to the forefront. I think lots of times supply chains are kind of secondary to the CEOs. Well, trust me, a lot of CEOs have been worried about their supply chain these days, and a lot of it's in the news. And what I hope people will use this is a way to build agility and resiliency in their supply chain, to develop contingency plans for how disruptions occur. Because in my experience, I think we sometimes focus too much on one component. When you build long, inflexible supply chains, it interferes with our ability to serve our consumers and ability to serve our customers. And that's a very important element of the supply chain. That's the core of it. And I hope what this order does and what this trend does is allow us to think more about the agility and the responsiveness of our supply chains to allow us to better serve our customers and build better and stronger supply chains.
No, agreed. And I mean, you've both touched upon it a little bit here, but I would like us to develop a little bit on these points in terms of what exactly, are the benefits of onshore supply chains, especially when, these disruptions occur. So, Stephany, maybe we can start with you.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about the competitiveness of it. So if you want to win government contract, or you are doing business with organizations that are committed to localization or reshoring, shortening your supply chain does, to Mike's point, add some agility and resiliency. And I'll let Mike speak to it in deeper. I think there's a lot of other considerations that we'll dive deeper into the webinar.
Yeah, look, the points are well stated here. The longer your supply chain gets, there's more opportunity for disruption. You have labor disruptions, you have weather disruptions, and transportation. I mean, with the world of transportation becoming more difficult, laws are becoming more difficult sometimes as we grow across international boundaries and we start shipping stuff very long distances. So this is the ability to avoid that instability. I think for a while there was trends, okay, and the trend was let's go offshore, let's find the lower costs, let's find lower cost kind of labor countries to control our costs better. And now it's kind of trending back to more onshoring. And I think, automation allows us to balance the cost a little bit. But there is a balance here. And I think a shorter supply chain that is closer to you allows you to have a little bit better control, but it also is more responsive to the changing needs. I've seen supply chains where, a flood in China or a tsunami somewhere disrupts it. And I think by getting it closer, it allows us better control and better predictability. And it avoids the risk of disruption. And, if you disrupt your supply chain, you start losing your revenue. And so we have to balance the cost with the loss in revenue.
Yeah, definitely. And I guess in a sense, you could also say that this actually helps, with the resiliency aspect of the supply chain and, creating that trust. I know this is something that we discussed a little bit, in our conversations. And Stephany, in terms of, looking at that, that trust, making sure to ensure that trust, with suppliers, I was wondering if you could maybe develop a little bit on that.
Yeah, I think Mike and I in previous conversation were talking about him being responsible for contingency planning at Procter & Gamble. And it's great to have a plan, but if you can't act on that plan, that makes it quite challenging, especially in disruptions. And disruptions, to Mike's point, has happened, right? We've seen trade wars where you have to actually navigate some pretty complex situations that, you've got some suppliers or some of their laborers that are at risk to what we've seen it with the Suez Canal costing millions of dollars on a daily basis, and something that we didn't, the world didn't expect and caused so much disruption. So that will keep happening. And so I think having the contingency plan and having access to the information to respond to that contingency plan, and ideally having some contingent suppliers or a disparity in your suppliers that's actually making it that you can be more agile and be more reactive. And because you can't control a lot of this disruption that happens, that it's environmental, political, having them locally, it allows you to be a little bit more in tune with what's happening and have a bit more control. And so again, it's weighting costs versus what are the lost opportunity of not having your supplier base to be able to deliver or having that type of disruption. The other piece of it is around, there's a lot more focus right now on sustainability, diversity, much more commitment than we've seen before on how does our business impact those requirements and also our communities. I was on a CPO advisory board last week, and the topic of community kept coming up. We have a responsibility to help our local community, and by employing suppliers that are local, we are also enabling them to hire and to rebuild our local economy, especially if we've seen so much disruption. And those SMBs are the backbone of our economy. And so if you're able to participate in that, and we're talking now, it's not just like a mission nice to have, it's actually, on investors' agenda, it's on, these are board requirements. These are things that executives have to report on, and localization having an impact on your local community is increasingly more important. And then we see things like the international regulation often differ from North America. For example, the United States, Mexico, Canada agreement, requires you to have local suppliers and obey by certain rules. So again, there's a lot of things to navigate. Then you touch upon trust. There's an example of one of our customers who had a supplier, I believe it was in China, and did an audit. So they actually physically went. They looked at the facility. It was beautiful, clean. It checked all the boxes. They came back a couple of years later. They went back to the facility and they said they don't know what happened, but it looked like a bomb. Like had disintegrated something, and they don't know what happened, but they would have never known without physically being on site and seeing the conditions of the facility that they were buying from, right? So and it's not necessarily it's going to be in the media. Even if you have something that's going to monitor changes on social media, will not give you necessarily the type of insight to know that something could be happening with your suppliers, because they're far further away. So a bit around having your suppliers closer, the ability to partner. I know we haven't been face to face in some times, but the ability to meet your suppliers in person, build better, stronger partnership, and have a little bit more influence in how they're hiring, maybe their sustainable practices and things like that. And then, we talk about costs, and Mike will touch more upon that, but I think we did sway quite far on cost reduction. I do think that has potentially an impact on innovation. If we're so swayed on cost, we kind of miss out on what innovative suppliers could be actually contributing to competitiveness and resiliency and sustainability. And so I think we're going to be a big shift in some of those countries where we used to actually have cost reduction are now, increasing labor costs. So I think reassessing that cost benefit may be important. Looking at the countries that you do business with, PA today, there's an opportunity to automate a lot of the things that were in the past, really quite cost effective offshore. And so I think there's a lot of things to balance in understanding sort of how to have that better distribution. And it comes down to when you're looking at disruption and having, again, a better distributed with a strong focus on localization is to comply to the executive order are some really important consideration.
Yeah, definitely. And you've touched upon two key words there for me, cost and automation. And Mike, I'm quite curious to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, let me touch on that one. Look, automation is a developing technology. I mean, we automate a lot of things. Automation's been around for many, many years. But what is happening is the cost of automation continues to go down while the cost of labor in other countries continues to go up. So it is an opportunity for us to automate more, and I think that is an awful lot of the future. And as somebody who's run manufacturing sites too, I don't like the hand labor. I mean, people picking something up and putting it here, picking it up, putting it here. That doesn't develop them as an individual. It doesn't develop the organization. I'd much rather teach people how to automate. They get into computer technology. They start developing their skills more. It creates for them a much better career and opportunity. So I like to automate appropriately. And I think as the cost of automation continues to come down, then it offsets some of the low-cost labor areas that we took offshoring too far. Okay, in some cases we ran it to say let's just get cheap the labor as we can, and leverage our manufacturing bases there. And I think as automation comes up, it will offset some of the potential cost issues. I would also challenge people to look more broadly at cost. I mean, it's not a dollar per hour question. And we unfortunately many times will calculate our cost based on a stable, perfect supply chain. I've never had a perfect supply chain, okay? It's interesting in my role. Every time there's a labor disruption, I read where it's at because it may be one of my sites. And there's a tornado or a tsunami or a hurricane or an earthquake, I run, it's like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? That's why I think, we don't calculate the disruptions that could occur and the lost revenue that could occur from that. A couple examples to build on Stephany's points maybe a little bit. We started contingency plan in my business when a tornado hit the Pringles plant in Jackson, Tennessee. I was there. We had 2 Pringles plants in the world, and we did 2/3 of the volume in Jackson. A tornado blew it apart. Now, it's a miraculous story, and it's its own story of we were back up in 8 days, but original estimate was 3 months. That was 2/3 of a $1 billion business. That would have been a disaster. Now, through heroic efforts of wonderful people that we had there, we recovered. But almost we said, we need contingency plans. Well, first we started with our plants, and we found out, we built a diaper plant in Mexico to supply the Mexican market. Then we realized, wait a minute, it's in an earthquake area. It's also in a floodplain. So what happens? Well, don't worry about it. It's been years since an earthquake's hit. Well, fortunately, we created contingency plans to say, what would we do if an earthquake or a flood hit it? Well, about 2 years later, a flood hit it. And while it wasn't perfect, we knew what to do, and we were able to shift quickly to keep that market in business while we took the time we needed to recover. Now, it's one thing to do it there, but it gets really complicated when you go to suppliers. I love the example that Stephany gave around the supplier in China where it looked clean at one time, but then later it looked worse. What happens is you have to know your suppliers, but you have to know your supplier's suppliers, and you start going down. I've had instances where I had a supplier that I really trusted, but then I went and somebody found a supplier of them that still supplied my product, that supplied them, that had problems in terms of labor issues. And it's like, I didn't want to be associated with that, but I didn't have the data to understand that. So supply chains are complicated. It's not just your own manufacturing site. but it's really your suppliers, and even importantly, it's your supplier's suppliers. So having that access to that information, if we're going to avoid instability, if we're going to help the reputation of our company, and we're going to really manage costs, we have to have transparency to all that data.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, I'm quite glad that you've kind of started touching upon this, because I would like to kind of take us, when we were having our chat, you discussed the Wakefield research report, where you recently partnered, both of you, Tealbook and Wakefield, recently partnered to survey over 200 supply chain professionals, I think it was, Stephany. So yeah, I was wondering if maybe you could tell us a little bit more on that, because I think it does link quite well with what Mike has just discussed.
Yeah, and we'll get into some of the data point, but what we were trying to accomplish there is understand what's the priorities of, in this case, it was supply chain and procurement leaders, and how prepared, like what was the readiness of COVID? And, of course, no one was prepared, but we wanted to understand at what level. And then doing a survey, we actually did a survey last year, which was, and if you're interested, we have it on our website to download. But it showed that it was 93 or 96% of supply chain and procurement leaders were having negative impact to their business on a regular basis due to poor data quality. And we want to unpack that a little bit more this year, especially in light of COVID. And now that we had been, almost a year post when everything sort of happened and the world shut down. And so, what we uncovered, it was not overly shocking. Probably to me, it was, the numbers were higher than I expected. And to support that, we talk about agility, and agility is like the topic that we've talked about for years, but no one's really understood how to achieve agility. We talk about disruption, what Mike and I have been talking about. No one's shocked in the audience thinking like, my supply chain is not complex. Of course it's complex. And the disruptions are coming faster from all sides, and the requirements are changing, and there's more requirements that are happening. There's more disruption on a day-to-day and aftermaths of the suppliers and in your suppliers. So these are really complex issues. And, the way that we've dealt with information in the past has not led to having better quality data. And that's really what we want to unpack here. And so this is recent. This was done in March. Again, this is the Wakefield research, and Nathan and I did a webinar a few times. Actually, yesterday we were presenting at ISM World, and it was really well received, because I think it's just, again, it gives you information. So when you're thinking about your transformation and you're looking at getting an investment thesis around how do I build a better data foundation so that I can actually respond faster, I can be more agile. And the what inspired me to build Tealbook is I saw that, with all the investment made in software, it didn't actually result in having better data quality. It didn't result in providing connectivity in that information so that, we can make better decisions. We bought software to workflow data, but still didn't end up with better data. So that was always the puzzle that I had in my mind, and led me to build the platform. But anyway, so with Wakefield, we want to support, what's happening in the market and be able to have conversations around it, and then give tools to procurement teams to start building the investment thesis so that they can start thinking about data in a way that could enable resiliency, agility, all the things that we're talking about. So what the data showed is 80% of procurement leaders were not completely confident in their supplier data. Not super shocking. Seeds of doubt that bloomed into the crisis when COVID rocked their industry. 82% of them discovered that their supplier data was less than completely adequate during the pandemic. And what we saw is, from day one, we had released a statement that we were going to give supplier lists for any companies that were disrupted by COVID. And within the first couple of weeks, we got 170 requests, right? From public sector to all kinds of industry. And these were companies that were struggling because initially some of their suppliers were impacted and they couldn't actually get the products that they needed to ensure that they had product in the hands of their consumers, like big impact on future revenue. But there was also a lot of shift in productions, like Brooks Brothers started sourcing for all the ingredients to make N95 masks that met the requirements. and you're sourcing for polypropylene, which is now super on demand, right? And where do you go when you've never sourced this before? And they ended up accessing information so that they could actually produce over 100,095 masks per day. But we've seen a lot of manufacturers shifting to trying to make ventilators and PPEs, and then just even finding PPEs alone to ensure that your employees could come into work so that they could actually continue, making the products that you're selling that's generating revenue for your business. And if you can't secure PPEs and your employees don't feel safe, again, other issues. So again, the pile of issues were pretty, they're just compiling. But what we saw here is pretty shocking that, over 80% of them didn't feel like they had the information they needed to be able to respond to these changes. So baseline, if you don't have information, you're scrambling, right? Even if you have a contingency plan and you don't have a way to take action on that contingency, yes, we'll have processes, but it will take time. And in situations like this, when you don't have time, it's more important than ever to have that data. What we saw is that data was actually not available. Another thing on this study is that 96% say that agility is more important cost savings for their company's bottom line in the long run. And this, to me, it's very hopeful because I think procurement specifically have been so focused in the past being measured on savings. Like, I'm a CEO. If I'm going to put procurement in my company, it's because I want some spend optimization. So there's a natural incline that procurement has been sort of the guardian of spend and looking at savings as the main KPI. And in order to do savings, having visibility into your spend has been very important. Spend has also been a data point that's been somewhat easier to control because you have invoices, because you have transaction, you're able to workflow to have visibility into your spend. But what happens with spend, is that it's important, but it's not everything. And when COVID hit, spend didn't really matter. That's not a data point that was overly useful because suddenly you can't even tap into your own supply base at 100% to see what other suppliers you already have under contract that could have, the capacity to be able to step in and provide the goods that you have. And often it's because you just don't know your supply base. You don't have access. You know your top suppliers really well, but what if there's suppliers in your vendor master already under contract that could provide, you just don't know that they sell or they have the capacity to be able to help. And so what we've seen is team going out on Google, consulting firms, getting lists of suppliers and scrambling to trying to find suppliers even outside of their own supplier base. So that's even more of a challenge because now you're sourcing, in potentially different countries. You're competing for very similar types of products and materials, and it makes it incredibly challenging. So I think it showed the opportunity to respond to those disruption, to be also better at responding to the needs of the business, because now all the disruption escalated some of the challenges all the way to the CEO and the board members. And so the pressures now to be able to be more responsive and be a driver of those types of change. Procurement can be actually a hero in many of the new requirements. And if you can get that agility, it's incredibly powerful. And agility means savings, right? Agility means hyper competitiveness, but it also means innovation. It also means localization. It also means sustainability, diversity, and all the other requirements. And so to me, it's a very positive, optimistic change that we're going to move from saving or spend as the construct to the supplier optimization. Like what are all the things that you need to consider in your supply base that's impacting your suppliers, and the extended network beyond your supplier base to see, what are opportunities or potential risks that I should be aware of and be able to respond, take action almost in real time. And the technology is here now. So again, this is all possible. We're not speculating a future, vision. This is now.
Yeah, definitely. And actually that leads quite nicely to our next session, because I think, when we had our conversation, Mike, you were saying that there was definitely, like Stephany was just saying now, that there has been a change in priorities almost. There has been a change in focus, and this change is quite essential. And I know that you've got a very neat little triangle theory that I would quite like for you to develop a little bit for our audience. But first, yeah, if you could develop a little bit on this idea of prioritization, and I'll take us to the slide for the triangle so that you can move on to that.
Yeah, look, let me just add a little bit to what has been said here. Look, we talked about contingency planning, and we started that when I had disruptions, and I created contingency plans. We rolled it out across the company, and what we found out is plans within our plants were pretty straightforward. But as Stephany said, as you started getting to suppliers, it got more complicated. And in baby care, we had a pretty balanced supply chain, and if a plant went down, we could recover. And we were lauded for our stability and the strength. But then we had a supplier go down, and that disrupted the whole thing much more than anything internally. So it's getting to that breadth of data that becomes so important. And what happens is when you have a disruption, we always called ourselves product supply, and it's like that means our job is to supply product. So you've got to keep that in mind, and your supply chain is only as strong as your weakest link, and that's why they call it a chain. And I think we went to offshoring because, look, every CEO in the world wants you to reduce costs, okay? I mean, I've said under some of the best CEOs in the world, the best thing to always say is, let's reduce costs. And as Stephany said, procurement gets a lot of pressure around, well, okay, we've done so much in our plants. Can you get a lower cost supplier? Surely there's lower cost suppliers out there. And that drove us a lot to some of the offshoring. And I don't know a company in the world that doesn't want to reduce costs, right? So it's pretty straightforward. But the reality is we have to have very strong innovation elements too. So on the right side there, many companies, depending on your company, is driven by innovation. Okay, innovation draws in new customers, innovation draws in new consumers. Your product can become obsolete if you don't innovate. So you always, when you're designing the supply chain, you have to keep the innovation element always in mind, because I need to innovate. So, and your supply chain design needs to take into consideration those innovation cycles. Sometimes they're once a year I'm innovating. I've had businesses where every year in the beauty business, you're turning something over and you got to innovate quickly. I've had other businesses where you have a platform that lasts for 7 years. Very different mindset around how I design the supply chain. But the one that we've been talking about a lot, it's kind of always been there, but it's now in the forefront, which is the agility. And that's my ability to respond to the customer and meet their needs. COVID has blown this all up. But I think the reality is, I have to have a product the consumer wants, but I have to be able to put it where they need it, when they want it. If it's not there, they're probably not be able to buy it. And number two, I start losing brand loyalty, and I start losing customer loyalty because they said, if you can't deliver it, then I'm going to go buy something different. And what happened during the COVID is some brands lost their loyalty because they're like, well, I used to buy this brand, but now I'm going to buy something else because at least they can deliver it to me. And what I hope we do is, offshoring was cool. We jumped that way. Onshoring or reshoring or whatever term we want to use is cool now. I would ask all of us as supply chain leaders to think about this balance. And it's a strategic balance that is different depending on the business you're in. If I'm in a commoditized business and people only buy me for cost, then cost is probably going to be a little more higher up. And I may have a business where, if it's a very commoditized good, I'm a farmer and I sell corn and soybeans, that's pretty commoditized. I got to really make sure I manage my costs. Agility, some of our customers now, some very big customers in the CPG world are even charging fines if you're late. I also need to understand how important that agility is to be able to respond to disruptions and get that product in the market. My consumer may go somewhere else if I don't deliver it. So I have to have design for agility. Let me take one from my recent example in blades and razors. We designed the supply chain differently. We have the best blades in the world. Sorry, Gillette, Venus, we're the best in the world. But the innovation was so critical and the technology was so critical that we had various types of blades, but our top tier blades were only made in two places, Boston and Berlin, because of the technology and the innovation needed there. But blades are easy to store, they're easy to ship. I needed agility on my packaging, razor, other elements. So that supply chain was very distributed, very local, because I had, dozens of types of blades. I had thousands of types of packages that I needed to respond quickly to the marketplace. So the agility aspect became incredibly critical there, whereas scale and innovation became critical on another part. So my challenge to supply chain leaders is that we think about these things in a balance. And historically, we've looked too much at cost, as we work with CEOs, it's like use the COVID learnings to say the disruption in our supply chain causes us to lose brand loyalty and it causes us to lose revenue. So how do we make sure we build a more resilient supply chain that balances cost, agility, and innovation? I would also challenge people to really dig into the details of it and take it more depth. Keep the learnings that, sometimes we may have a good internal supply chain or a good primary supply chain, but go to the secondary suppliers. When a hurricane hit in the New Jersey area, it took out a lot of perfume suppliers. Guess what? A lot of perfumers are in that area. Guess what? It disrupted a lot of businesses. The plants were fine, but there was an issue there. So and in any case, it comes down to a strategic analysis of your supply chain and your suppliers. It also takes very good data to understand where they are and what their capabilities are. And the third thing I want to build on that Stephany said is that procurement needs to be at the table as a partner. Historically, they've got to be there to help you think through that, to think through it in a way to make sure that, so many big companies look at their supply chain as their manufacturing plant. That's only a small percentage. And then they look at I had thousands of suppliers in my last two businesses, thousands in each one of the businesses. The top 10, I personally met with. I knew them personally. I knew the CEOs. But what about the rest of them? And what about their suppliers? And what I found is invariably my surprises came in places I didn't expect them to come. And that's where this solid data is the foundation of all of this. So I hope we do react to the reshoring to build more agile supply chains. I think agility is here to stay, and we should never forget it. But I would ask supply chain leaders to always think about the balance and don't try to, it's not a single answer. It's a strategic answer based on what drives your business.
Yeah, definitely. And you've touched upon it a little bit there, but obviously, we've discussed offshoring. We've discussed why we naturally went there. We've discussed, the need for cost saving. We discussed the need for agility. We've touched upon a little bit of, on technology and data. But I was wondering if maybe we could delve just a little bit deeper into reshoring itself. For our audience today, I know that there's no one size fits all, but if you were to kind of take them through almost like a step-by-step, like how do they begin? How do they get to this point, of reshoring? And maybe, Stephany, we can start with you.
Yeah, I think to me it comes with, now I'm biased on this, but I do believe that data is core. If you don't have access to good quality information about your supplier base, it makes it incredibly difficult. If you're only focused on what you know, which is very little compared to all the things you should know, you're going to be missing out on major opportunities. And so, when I think of the history and why we came to a place where we don't have good quality data, I'm not going to go back into too much details, but we've been buying software as a way to workflow information, and each company has built their own technology ecosystem. And the challenge that we get with this is that every time you buy software, it creates its own island of information. And the cost of integrating systems to each other has been incredibly expensive. Actually, in that same Wakefield research, it says that it costs $2,400 per supplier record to maintain. Imagine if you have 30,000 suppliers, we're talking about millions of dollars in cost, and it still doesn't give you that unified, connected view of your entire supplier base. When we look at the future and all these new solutions that are coming to market that are niche and digital, and they made you believe that you're going to digitize your supply chain or your procurement function with these new tools, you have to think how they're going to connect to my legacy system. Again, probably will not result in better data because it costs a lot of money to maintain information and software. If you keep them as standalone, you're going to have data islands. You're going to have to train people on multiple solutions. You're going to have to invite suppliers in multiple portals, and that's not going to give you that better data. So when I think of how we've built our technology stack to date, it makes it very disparate. It makes it incredibly challenging to have good visibility. And so I think, the opportunity that we have with the new computing and the technology that is available today is to be able to activate the vendor base, to give you visibility across 100% of your suppliers in a way that you couldn't do through workflow and services at a speed that keeps up with the market, because there's a lot of change that happen much faster. Having that visibility gives you a baseline of distribution where your supplier base is how they're distributed, but it also gives you indicators to know where do you have significant overlap, where's that supply base mostly located in certain categories, where are you missing opportunities to reshore or increase competitiveness or access innovation, and then you can start putting a plan in place of how these use cases are going to drive change within the organization, and then you can put processes and plan in place, and then get technology. So I'm talking pretty high level right now, but the technology is here. You can activate your vendor base so that you have better visibility. It gives you a mechanism to improve the quality of your data over time and bring connectivities and unification to all these data points. I think I was talking to actually the former CPO at Procter & Gamble with Mike, and she was talking about all the investment that they had made in software, significant, right? These are companies that are quite mature, that have been in digital transformation for some time. But the one biggest challenge is that, yes, we have good S2P. Yes, we have good vendor data management. Maybe we have all these different tools, but it's the connectivities of all these systems that we're missing. And if we don't have that connectivities, if we don't have visibility and information that enhance what I know about my suppliers, we're not going to be able to truly digitize. That's where we can't do enablement. We can't give access to that information to people making decisions every day. That doesn't allow us to be truly agile and respond to market changes or the demands of the business, because we just don't have good visibility. And so, thinking of the world around how do I bring my technology ecosystem around a data foundation, that the data foundation provides better data across my system, more connectivities, and gives me visibility of my supplier base and the suppliers I should know about, is, to me, it's not just it's a nice to have, it's a must have for the future to be able to respond to market changes, to disruptions, and be much better equipped to achieve digital procurement success.
I completely agree with you on that. Oh, sorry, Mike. My bad. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to add. This is a really important topic around how do we do this, because there's a lot of, it's easy to talk the theory, it's hard to actually do the practice, and your execution is all that your customer sees. They don't see the theory that you've got behind your supply chain. They see what you can execute. And I think I don't think Steph knows this. In the dark ages, I was one of P&G's first modeling people, the first full-time modeler. And what I found is creating the models were easy. Getting the data to feed into the models that were accurate was really hard. So that's part of the reason I align with the vision that Steph has on this. And I think that, as you go down this journey, there's a historic kind of mindset of we pick certain suppliers that we know, that we have experience with. And I lived in a world where R&D will pick a supplier that they know, that they trust to develop a product. But, in my old job, I made billions of things and hundreds of millions of things. And when you're starting to get into that, you need a more diverse supplier base. And so it comes with, and I use this opportunity to reshore as a way to create competition in your supply base. I'm all for supplier partnerships, but single supply gets really risky, both from an agility standpoint and a competition standpoint. I believe in competition. I live in a competitive world. competition has always made me better. It's always made my company better. And frankly, it makes your suppliers better. So I think getting a database where I can create a competitive environment, and there's so many times where people say, this is the only supplier that can do this in the world. And it's like, really? How do you know that? So I think creating that competition where at least you can get 2 or 3, and you get the benefits of not only getting agility, because I have multiple supply, and resiliency, but you also get the benefit of having cost competition, which makes both of those suppliers, or 3 of those suppliers, or however many it is, much better. So I think getting this data and reshoring use as a way to create competition. Don't throw out your old ones. Create new ones to create a more balance and more competition. There's another important point there. As you know, I historically worked for a big company, and one of the challenges you're really looking for is I got to find more innovation. We get P&G in recent years, we get at least half of our innovation from our suppliers. Now, some of those are the big suppliers that everybody knows, but an awful lot of them are the smaller ones. And as since I've been advising some small companies, there's a tremendous amount of innovation coming out of the smaller companies, the innovative companies. We need to find those companies and nourish them. And some of our biggest innovations have come from smaller companies that we were able to identify and then help build and grow with them, where we could help them scale and they can innovate to add to what we're doing and to innovate and to lead to bigger innovations. So these benefits there can really help drive your business, but you got to have the right data and find them. Historically, I found them through who do you know? Having a more comprehensive way to find them would have been a tremendous benefit to me.
Well, I have a couple of points to this. One of my favorite examples, and there's hundreds of how data enables procurement to drive more value. But one was I was talking to clients like, what are some examples that you know about how our technology's allowed to drive change? And around that week, someone had a category manager had seen, or sourcing manager had seen, that there's a contract that was coming up for renewal with a piping supplier, and approached a business to say, hey, I see that this contract, we would like to go through a bid. And the business right away pushed back, and they say there's only one supplier in the world that can do this type of piping. And normally that sourcing manager would sort of go back, probably do some research if they're, they want to challenge the business to think differently, and come back with some options if they had the power. But in that conversation, the sourcing manager was able to open their Tealbook and be able to look by type of piping. They clicked similar companies. They found similar type of piping relevant to the pharma industry, which was this company, and found 6 additional options by the type of piping. And in that conversation, I said, listen, I just looked at Tealbook. It looks like there's 6 other companies that could provide the same type of piping. Do you mind if we just invite them to bid? It won't take more than a week to get responses. And, we just want to make sure we're getting the most value out of the suppliers that we're using. And the business couldn't push back because that person had the information in their hand to be able to influence a decision in the conversation, not after the invoice, or the PO was issued. And they ended up saving $25 million in one sourcing event alone. So this, again, is a great example of what Mike is talking about. Is they've dealt with the same supplier for a long time. They didn't challenge pricing. They didn't see if there's opportunities to negotiate, and they were able to save $25 million in one single sourcing event. And we're talking about companies who have hundreds of, like I think their spend is around $25 billion, right? So now add this to more influences, more opportunities to drive different types of decisions. It could be incredible. It could represent hundreds of millions of dollars. And the other point around supplier diversity, because it is quite topical. I know that supplier diversity was a big topic yesterday, but when I talk to leaders, COOs, CEOs of companies, and CPOs are obviously quite involved and are able to drive this type of change. But what I'm hearing is, yes, one, supplier diversity is important for many reasons, but it's the pipeline for innovation. And these suppliers, by definition, are kind of hard to find. They're hard to access good information about them. They're hard to include in opportunities. And what we found out through in recent research is that only 5% of suppliers who meet the requirements are in fact certified. That means that when a large enterprise make a commitment to supplier diversity, that 95% of the businesses that meet small and diversity requirements are not certified. So that means they can't be recognized and reported in supplier diversity, spend data. And so, again, this is a huge opportunity to look at, using information to understand who are your suppliers who meet the requirements, who are certified, but almost more importantly, which ones meet the requirements that are not certified, because that's a pipeline to be able to not only guide them to get certified, but it's a huge pipeline for innovation. And that's really what is prompting a lot of the organizations to want to, access more small and diverse businesses, because this is really the place where you can get the most innovation. And thinking about that triangle, it really helps support the ability to look at cost avoidance, but also when you're looking at innovation, it's bringing it back to the top line. And that's really what the executives are looking to see with some of the efforts that are being put together.
Yeah, definitely. And I'm just conscious that we've got very little time left on our session. So obviously to our audience, if you have any burning questions, now's your absolute last chance to ask them. But I just want to kind of build a little bit on what you've said there, Stephany, and maybe ask Mike of your thoughts there, because obviously, some of the questions that we get quite a lot from our members in terms of supplier diversity is quite a lot of them obviously have most of their components that are being made in one specific location, usually China. It's like, how do they go about reshoring if they have everything over there and then they're on the other side of the world? Do you have any practical advice on how they can go about that?
Well, let me say a couple of things. First is a lot on the diversity of the suppliers is, particularly if you think about, is many of these, the China suppliers for a lot of these components have become the big ones. So you need to find some of the smaller ones that are starting up, and by definition, they're harder to find, okay? And so it's easy to go through and list who are the top suppliers for this on a website. You're going to get the big ones. It's going to be harder to find the local ones that are in some of the startup companies, and I'm amazed at some of the startup companies that are happening in U.S. and Europe and Eastern Europe that are really trying to bring this value back and try to bring some of this back. But by definition, they're some of the smaller ones. And historically, the women and diverse-led ones are, the reason we're putting a focus on, and a lot of them are startup and smaller companies. So by definition, it makes it harder to find. So you need a tool like Tealbook or those connections to find those suppliers. The second advice I would give is try to look for not what the supplier is, but what they can become. Some of our best suppliers are suppliers that we worked with to develop. In our razor business, we had two suppliers that were about equal. One of them was a smaller supplier that was really willing to work with us and really invest in them. Right now, they are the much bigger supplier. And why is that? Because they were willing to invest with us, and we were willing to invest in them. And what happened is they became our top supplier. The other one was too worried about Apple and Samsung and other people that they're like, fine, you go work with them. I'm going to work with this supplier that's a little bit smaller, a little bit hungrier, but really wants to work with me. And so that's one of the other advice is look for the capabilities they have and what they can become.
Brilliant. And like I said, we are reaching to the end, and I'm quite keen, I think this slide does help summarize quite well the point. So, Stephany, maybe we can start with you and then finish on Mike. How would you kind of conclude? And what, if you had also, maybe I'm going to put you guys on the spot, if you had maybe a call for action, if that makes sense, what should procurement really prioritize in terms of reshoring? What should they do, to get ahead?
Yeah, I do. So to me, it comes back to having visibility, right? Without visibility, good access to quality data across 100% of your supplier base, you just don't know what you don't know, and not able to give yourself opportunities to unlock these use cases that could drive significant value. And when we're talking about reshoring, just understanding where your supplier base is, prominently located, having visibility in your tier 1, ideally having visibility in your tier 2 suppliers so that you also understand the risk, and that's harder to get. And so happy to explore that with you, but there's ways to be able to identify trends and opportunities within that tier 2. Because without data, you just are blinded. You can't make really good decisions and plan appropriately. And then if you don't have that data accessible to the organization, then people making decisions every day are not able to influence or to react. So I think first is the leadership team, activate your vendor master. You can improve visibility, quality of information, well beyond spend data. If you don't have data below your spend item level, you're really operating blindly, and you're not able to not just optimize your team, but optimize the technology you've invested into and the ones that you're going to continue investing in the future. And you're certainly not able to fully optimize your supplier base. And having that visibility allows you to, again, put a plan how and where it's important to look at reshoring, where it's important to have more diversification of your supply base, where do you have opportunity to increase localization because you've got similar suppliers that are local that you may not be aware of, be able to increase access to suppliers that are small and diverse, that are potentially also local, but that can ignite some innovation opportunities. Talking about sustainability is the same. If you're able to help local community and have a social impact, those are all things that your leadership team is looking for. It will allow you to be a significant value add and really drive some of those initiatives for the organization. So I think it's a huge opportunity. I think it's the time, and we've heard this now for a year, it's a time for procurement, but that's because we failed. I mean, the disruption and why supply chain has been in the forefront of all the newspaper for the past years, frankly, because we were not prepared. And let's not have that happen again. If we have good quality data, if we have a solid data foundation, the rest, then it's just about be able to measure and report and make changes because you understand your business, you understand your supply base, and you're able to make better decisions. So that's my thoughts.
Mike,
what
what
I
about
would
you?
challenge people to don't forget COVID. Okay, I mean, I used to use the phrase "never waste a crisis." We have tremendous learnings from that. Don't forget it in terms of creating the importance of agility, the importance of diversity, and strike a balance in terms of your supply chain for how to design it in a way that meets all the customer needs. I would ask procurement to be bold in putting options on the table and challenging the norm to say, let's not forget what we've learned and to create greater agility. And if we do it right, we'll also create lower costs and more innovation. So do it in a way that is a balanced business perspective to the CEOs and to the supply chain leaders to say, here is how this is going to drive our business to be more responsive and more agile to what we need, our customer needs, so that we're ready if things happen again. But it also drives cost and innovation in a way that's balanced. And to do that, you've got to have good data. And to do that, it's got to be comprehensive data from end to end. And that's not easy to get. So be bold and be challenging to this to make sure we don't forget the lessons we learned and build a better and stronger supply chain in the future.
Thank you so much, guys. It's been an absolute pleasure having you with us today. To our audience, I mean, this is a topic we could talk about for hours, so we do apologize if we haven't gotten to your questions. The questions will be sent to Stephany and Mike later, so they will try their best to get back to you. I would like to thank our partners, Tealbook. I would like to thank Mary and Christine, who have been amazing in helping put this together. I would, as I mentioned previously, this is a part of a whole Q2 series. So, if you want to continue the discussion with our other partners, we do have a registration link available to you, so please, by all means, register. And finally, I'm just going to do a very cheeky plug because at Procurement Leaders, we have our Innovation in Digitalization and Tech event next week. And it's very apropos because at the end of the day, as Stephany and Mike have said, it is about data, it is about visibility, it is about innovating. That's how you move forward. So if you want to hear a little bit more about this, please register. Again, the link will be in the additional resources. Stephany, Mike, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been an absolute pleasure working with you guys, and I look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you for having us.